important in this perspective is, of course, the question of citizenship, that we have to recognize on the ground of the so-called jus soli, very famous, this principle, if we want to realize an effective integration of migrants. And lastly, in order to better understand the complexity, Samir Amin this morning has said that the migration is, as also Sayad says, migration is a total social reality with many levels, not only the economic one, but also anthropological, psychological too, political, legal, a total. So this, as a consequence, this implies the necessity of having a global policy for migration, not only an economic policy for migration. And last, in order to better understand the complexity of the problem of migration, we have to realize that it depends on the possibility of considering this question, emigration and immigration. It is the fact of leaving the cultures, the families, the parents, and the immigration, the desire of being integrated in a different society with different cultures, with prejudice, with difficulty to be understood in our real identity. And during the 20th century, in the perspective of emigration, one has considered the linkage between migration development as a consequence of the imbalances in the levels of development among different countries. As regards the problem of immigration, it has been mainly considered through the analysis of the impact on the receiving societies. If the concept of co-development implies the existence of a mutual benefit both for the country of origin and of reception, we have to consider now the problem of the status, legal status, and of the integration of migrant people in the receiving countries. And this means to analyze the questions of the migrants' rights as minorities' rights in the frame of a multicultural society, multicultural, polyethnic, polyconfessional, polyreligious society. But what is multiculturalism? While endorsing non-discrimination rights, multiculturalism emphasizes above all the importance to political action of two evaluative judgments. First of all, the belief that individual freedom and prosperity depend on full and unimpeded membership in a respected and flourishing cultural group. That means that we have to recognize both individual and the collective rights. Second, a belief in a value pluralism, and in particular, in the same validity of diverse values embodied in practices of different societies. In the view of multiculturalism, it is not possible to establish a hierarchy among the different values of different social groups. It is not possible to establish that that the values of a group are higher than the values of another one. Of course, we can put some limits as regards some practices, but we cannot affirm that a culture is superior to another one. As a consequence, there is no room for talk of a minority problem or of a majority tolerating the minorities. Multiculturalism goes beyond the primacy of the majority principle. But we have to understand that it is the paradox of multiculturalism that while endorsing the perpetuation of several cultural groups in a single political society, requires also the existence of a common culture, of a unique culture, the culture of mutual recognition that is the ground of multiculturalism. Just as important as these premises are also its consequences. Multiculturalism, in other words, ought to be understood to entail the customs and practices of the different groups should be recognized in law, And that implies the consequence that we have to recognize special liberties, particular liberties to the different cultural groups in our societies. This last consideration, the idea of a culture of mutual recognition and the necessity of recognizing special liberties, introduces the problem of integration. Which is integration? An important scholar says that this problem can be solved by way of two-pronged approach that combines two concepts, two levels of integration. On the one hand, we have the so-called ethico-cultural integration. That means that the migrants have a right to live in keeping with their own traditions and customs, and to accordingly educate and raise their children. These rights also gives the migrant the option to reject these customs and thence choose a different way of life, even if this implies the risk that the migrant have a split identity. And on the other hand, on the second level, there is also what we call the politico-constitutional integration, in which case integration is achieved by virtue of each migrant's acceptance of the principles enshrined in the constitution of the country to which he or she has migrated. Now, importantly, very importantly, in this model is that the fact it proceeds from the basic premise that our societies must be grounded in the idea, in the concept of constitution, and not in the concept of nation, because the idea of nation is an ethnic, naturalistic concept that refuses the non-nationals. We have to go beyond the idea of nation. We have to leave apart the idea of nation if we want to get to a real integration of migrants in our societies. And then, at the end of this consideration, we can take up the last issue regarding this problem, that is, to what extent can the state welcome, accept migrants? There are two distinct traditions in Western legal political thoughts. On the one hand, there is the tradition that recognizes the state as having the discretionary power to decide whom to welcome and whom to reject. On the other hand, there is the view that the duty of hospitality is not in conflict with the state's interest. Hospitality and interest corresponds. Bearing out this latter view are the figures, for instance, that we have on entrepreneurship among foreigners in Italy. 7.2% of sole proprietorships in Italy are run by entrepreneurs born outside the European Union. But despite such solid data, plans to integrate immigrant population continue to meet stiff resistance, strong resistance. The most widely proffered argument is that we must first attend to the needs of our national citizens, and only then to those of non-citizens. This argument warrants closer conclusions and consideration. In 1983, an American scholar asked whether citizens, as long as they can draw on surplus resources, as long as they have surplus resources at their disposal, if in this case they are morally bound, this was the question, to admit immigrants from poorer countries. This scholar asked that caps, that is limits, could be placed on immigration the moment that not doing so could hamper, could impede the government's effort to advance and asylum seekers, when in fact quite the opposite side is true. Indeed, it is a necessary direct correlation that ties European prosperity and the underdevelopment of the so-called underdeveloped countries. Frantz Fanon once wrote that Europe is literally the creation of the third world, the creation of the third world. The problem must therefore be addressed within the framework of a global economy by broadening the reach of international cooperation policies. Cooperation must move beyond the model of centralized interventions aimed at stimulating growth exclusively understood in quantitative economic terms and indifferent to the native cultures. Indeed, this model has contributed to altering and destroying local socio-economic systems, giving way to non-productive economic systems. In place of this perspective, on the one hand, we need a cooperative model based on humanitarian exchange, that is, on the idea of involving and contracting with local organizations in the frame of democratic forms of government. And on the other hand, we have to accept and favor the integration of migrants in our societies in consideration of their contribution to the development. In short, and to conclude, immigrants contribute to the creation of our national wealth. They contribute above all to maintaining the current levels of social security of national citizens. Europe's wealth is owed to a great extent to the third world. Furthermore, we need development cooperation measures that take into account the cultures of the populations intended to benefit from these measures, thereby giving place to humanitarian exchange rather than to humanitarian intervention. Because it is a grave responsibility of the Western countries, I think above all of the situation in Arab countries of the southern shore of the Mediterranean. It is a grave responsibility that Western countries bear for their role in supporting dictatorships, which have diverted to their patrons the funds raised for their people. But unfortunately, after many years of intense debate, now we can observe, on one hand, fewer attempts to actively include migration concerns in development policy, and on the other hand, an increasing attention, as Dr. Venturi has very correctly said, an increasing attention to foster the return of the so-called irregular migrants and failed asylum seekers. These new policies are the consequence of the present geopolitical context. In this situation, there is a great alarm for massive, uncontrolled migration flows, and above all, a growing attention to the possible risks for the security, so-called security of Western countries. But in this perspective, security is not a correct word. In this perspective, security means rather safety. Safety, that is the protection against the risks that we think that are represented by the migrants. But I think that we have to fight strongly, actively, in order to change this perspective. Thank you.